You've quilted or tied and trimmed your quilt. Now it's time to put on the binding. I'm Jan Howell. Welcome back to my channel. This is part 5 of my DIY quilting series, and I'm going to show you how to measure, cut, and apply your binding. I'm going to show you all the basic binding tips and tricks that maybe you haven't seen before. So make sure you watch the whole video. And if you haven't watched the previous videos in the series, make sure you do that. So without any further chit chat, let's get started. First thing, let's go over the materials and items that you'll need. I have chosen this cute cotton stripe fabric. I know in a previous tutorial I was going to bind this in this brown stripe, but I thought I would give it a little bit more contrast and use this blue stripe, which I really like too. We'll be going over in detail how to measure so you know how much fabric that you'll need, and it depends on the size of your quilt, and that might help determine if you have enough of the fabric that you want to use or not. You'll need a cutting mat, a cutting ruler. You can use scissors, but really a rotary cutter and a rotary mat and ruler is something that doesn't really cost that much, and you'll use it a ton, and it makes things so much easier. And I'll put some links in the description below of some of these items and the things that I trust and use frequently. You'll need a pair of fabric scissors, some pins. I like using these little fabric clips. You'll need some kind of writing device. You can just use a pencil, but I like using these fabric pens that disappear. The ink disappears when you press them with an iron or heat. I like using this square ruler. You can just use your rotary cutter ruler as well. You'll need your iron, your ironing mat, and your sewing machine. Before you cut the strips of binding, you'll have to know how much you're going to cut and how big the strips will be. It's common for quilters to cut their binding 2.5 inches wide. You can do a little bit more, you can do less if you want, but probably no less than 2 inches. I have created a binding measuring formula PDF that you can download and print for free. I'll put the link in the description below where you can get that, but that just makes it helpful to put everything right down on paper so you know how much to use. So the first thing is to measure your quilt. You'll measure the width of the quilt and write that number down, and then you're going to multiply that by 2, and I get this number 88. Measure the height of your quilt. My quilt was 39 inches, and so I multiplied that by 2 and got 78 inches. You'll add those two numbers together and add 12 inches for the binding seams. That's just a good estimate for your binding seams, and that will give you the circumference of the binding that you'll need. How many strips of fabric are you going to need to cut? That's easy. You determine how wide your fabric is. Now, if you just buy a cotton piece from the fabric store on the bolt, usually it's anywhere from 42 to 44 inches, 45 even wide. I measured mine, it was 45 inches wide. Sometimes I use fabric that is 60 inches wide. I would put that number down. You'll divide the circumference by the width of the fabric, and then you'll get how many strips. Most likely it's going to be an odd number. So you want to round it up. Like this was 3.9. Sometimes it'll be 3.5. It was 3 point anything. I would round it up to the next, like 4. This was 3.9. I'm going to cut probably 5 strips just to be safe. And if you want to know how much fabric yardage you'll need, you just take that number here, how many strips you're going to cut, times it by 2.5, which is the width of my binding, and then you'll get 10 inches. So I know that if I have a piece of fabric and I only need 10 inches, which is pretty doable, that is how much yardage you'll need. Something else that I should mention is if you want to use binding that is cut on the diagonal, which is bias tape pretty much, you can use that, but you don't need to. On straight edges where we don't have to round the corner or anything, you can just use your binding again with the grain of the fabric. And I am cutting it strips this way, so I have this cute stripe along the edge. If I were sewing that on, which would be cute too, as a diagonal stripe, I would cut bias strips. And I have a whole separate tutorial showing you how to easily do that. You can check that out if you want it cut on the diagonal. Most likely your fabric will be folded like this with the two selvage edges together. Now we want to square up and get a straight edge first. Let me just show you quickly how to do that. I'm going to put the fold closest to me. I'm going to line up the selvage edges the best I can and just give it a little shake. And see how I have my finger between the fabric edges? That way I can shift it left or right. Now, you may not be able to see this, but as I shift it, maybe just a little bit to the left and hang it, lining up the edges, you can see that it doesn't lay flat, especially on the folded area. It's just kind of wonky. So if I shift that a little bit, let's just go with what it was cut at the store, which most likely wasn't straight. But I'm going to lay that like so. Smooth it out. And then when I bring the folded edge towards me, line it up either on the edge of the table or one of these lines on your cutting mat. And a stripe is really a good indicator because see that stripe? It is going straight and lined up all the way down. Maybe just shifting just a tad. I'm going to square up the bottom of my ruler with that line. And what I really like to do is put a hand weight on the top of my ruler so that it stays in place while I'm cutting. And I'm just taking just a little bit off. There, see that? Make sure that you're using a fresh or a very sharp blade. Makes the cutting strips so much easier. And it doesn't take much time to switch that out if you haven't changed your blade for a while. You don't have to square off the other edge. We've got that fold on the right line and this cut. I'm going to flip it over. If you are right-handed, you want the fresh cut on the left. Now, can you see that little wrinkle in the fabric? If I cut that with that wrinkle, it's going to skew the edge, and we don't want that. So I'm going to take a second just to press that. Okay, much better. Now, if your mat isn't deep enough, you can fold it in half and line up the edges. Make sure this is smoothed out. Let me show you a little tip that I have found that's really helpful, especially for those of us who our eyes have a hard time focusing sometimes on these little lines to make sure that it's straight. You can use masking tape. This is painter's tape. And I have located my 2.5 inches on the ruler. And instead of trying to find that every time I put it down, I can just automatically go to that line. We're going to find that edge. I'm going to add another piece of tape further down the ruler just so it's easier to see. I'm lining up that edge with the cut edge of the fabric. And there you have one strip. Now, something that I have found and I like to share when I find something really cool. Now, I have been wanting one of these rulers for a long time. And I finally broke down and justified buying one. It has these little slits in it for cutting binding and trim, and it cuts them fast, efficient, and really slick. It's a Stripology XL ruler. They have smaller ones, but I got this bigger one, and let me show you how that works. So you take your fabric that you're cutting strips with and place it down. Our edges, this edge is even. It has already marked out these 2.5-inch marks. So the 2.5 is a square. So every square line on the ruler is 2.5 inches, which is great because that's what most quilters use. And so you line up the edge of the fold, the edge of the cut edge of the fabric. I'm going to put a weight down over on the right, and then I'm going to find that first square and make that cut. And I'll go down to the next square, which is the next 2.5 cut. There's no sitting there and looking and finding where the line is. Wow, this is so slick. And then the next one, and I've already made that cut. I'm going to cut that extra one just in case, and I might use that binding for something else because I really like this stripe. Ta-da! Isn't that awesome? All right, I have my 4 needed strips plus 1 extra, and now we're going to sew them together. This is where you'll need some pins and your pen and a straight edge of some kind. All right, I'm going to open up the strips, place the right side facing up, take your next strip, place it right side facing down at a 90-degree angle. Now we don't want to use the selvage edges of the fabric, even if that print went all the way out to the edge. You don't want to use the selvage edge because it's woven just a little bit different. And this is nice with the stripe because you can tell if it's straight or not. We're going to be making a diagonal 45-degree line from this corner, this little notch right here. You see that little notch where they come together? I'm going to put my ruler down right at that point and then find the other point right there and make a line. I'm going to pin all the strips together before I take it to the sewing machine. That will save me a trip. I'm just using a straight stitch. Now I'm going to make sure that as I've moved my fabric around that it hasn't shifted, and it did a little bit. So I'm going to make sure that that line is right in the corner. Then I'll move on to the next one. Now, let me explain why we sew that on a diagonal. If we were to sew a straight seam, there would be a lot of bulk when we fold that over a few times. Look how much bulk there is in that area. This, when we sew it on a diagonal, it spreads out that seam so it's not all in one place. And look how nice that looks. You can't even tell where it's joined. Press that seam allowance open, and see those little dog ears on the side? We're just going to clip those off. So I'm going to go down and do that for every seam. I wanted to show you how to join striped fabric. This is a great tip to know because sometimes this can be very challenging, lining up those lines, and especially on a diagonal. But I have found a technique that is very simple and it works really well. So let me show you how that's done, and then we'll get back to the other sections of the tutorial. Let's say we need to join these two pieces. This is a continuous strip that we've made, and I need to join those edges. But if I use a straight edge, I've talked about this before, I'm going to have a lot of bulk on that particular section of your quilt, and you don't want that. As I've shown before, we've sewn a diagonal that spreads that seam out a little bit better. But how do you do that? Like if I were to just join that like I usually have you do from notch to notch, if I open that up, most likely it's not going to line up, and that is what your seam is going to look like. Not real great. So let me show you how you can not even tell where the seam is, and it's a really easy thing to do. This has multiple colors, and I chose this fabric so that if you have directional fabric, you know how to flip it. So these two, if I were to cut the strip, it would be like this. And to check, I'm going to bring those colors together and see how they're lining up. I'm going to bring the ends together like this. Before I do anything else, take the piece on the right and just flip it up so the wrong side is facing. Spray a little bit, and then I'm going to press that to starch it. Take that right corner and flip it to the left. Another pass with the iron to make a crease. I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to glide it back and forth until I find the print matches. So this is pretty good. I didn't have to, depending on how close your repetition is on your fabric, I'm not going to have to slide it down too much. I'm going to line up, see how those stripes are lining up, and you want to line up that top section with the top section of the bottom piece here. So you could slide it up or down. Ideally, we want it lined up there. So there's not a big gap here and not a big gap up there. So you can kind of have to just move it around depending on your strip of fabric. Now I've got that lined up. I want you to take your tape and just rip off a couple pieces that are about 3 inches and have those handy. Hold it with your fingers and then flip it open so that you can put your finger on that bottom piece. I'm going to open that up, trying not to shift the fabric at all. Now usually I'll pin this in place, and by the time I get to the sewing machine, this is shifted. The lines aren't even, and it's so frustrating, even if I put a couple pins in. So I find this tape really works. You're going to have those tape pre-pulled off so that you don't have to rip that, and I'm going to apply that. The most important thing is you get that right side taped down. Now it doesn't matter if this is over the fold line because we are going to pull that off and it comes off really easily. That folded crease is right in the notch of that joint there and at the point there. I'm going to secure that top edge piece just a little bit and mark that line. And it's not going anywhere. So I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and backstitch and backstitch, and then we'll open that up and see what happens. So another little tip is do not put your wool mat over your cutting mat. I've learned that the hard way. I ruined a cutting mat because of the heat going through onto the cutting mat. So I always slide that off to the side. I know there's a lot of controversy whether to fold the binding over and press it or not. Some say it's hard to adjust. I've tried it both ways, and I think folding it in half and pressing it is nicer, and I haven't really come upon any problems doing that. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to line up the edges and press that in half. All right, now let's apply the binding to our quilt. Now there are a couple ways that you can apply binding. You can sew it on the right side first, flip it over, and then hand stitch it all the way around, which I like to do. I know I'm probably an odd duck that, but I find it's a relaxing thing, and it does look a little bit more professional. But if you want to sew it with the sewing machine, both sides, no problem, and it will still turn out looking really nice. If that's the case, you'll start by applying the binding to the back side or the wrong side of the quilt. I'll show you this method, and then you can watch one of my other tutorials on how to apply the binding with your hand stitching. We're going to come to the bottom center of the quilt first, and you'll start in the middle of the quilt. I'm going to leave about a 10 or 12 inch tail, and you'll be applying the raw edges of the binding to the raw edges of the quilt. So that's about center point, and we're leaving a tail because when we join the two, the longer the tail, the easier it's going to be. You can use these clips to clip it in place, and I like to put just a few clips in, and then I can line it up as I sew. Then it gives me a little bit more freedom when I'm doing the mitered corners. One thing to keep in mind is that you do not want your seam of the binding to be in the corner or close to the corner, because that will make your mitered corners look kind of wonky and be too bulky. So I'm just going to eyeball that and make sure that we're okay. For example, if this seam of my binding was about here or here, I would want to adjust the start point. So you don't want to just sew and then, oh, I've got to unpick all that because this is too close. What I would do is just come back to the start. This is, of course, when you're pinning it in place. Pull it up this way or down this way just a little bit. So let's go to the sewing machine and start. You're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I have my regular presser foot on. You can use your 1/4 inch presser foot if you have one. I do have one, but I like using my regular foot. I'll bring my needle down so that the edge of the presser foot is along the edge of the binding. And then I'm going to adjust my needle to the right a little bit to give me my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And there's a little red dot on there that shows the 1/4 inch, and I'm going to back stitch. You don't want to pull the binding. You want to just lay it on as you sew. Now this is how you're going to do your mitered corners. You'll get so that you will be able to just really eyeball it where you need to stop, but if you want to put a little line with your marker where that 1/4 inch would be to stop. Right there. Leave your needle down, pivot your quilt, and we're going to sew off at an angle, coming out right up the tip of the quilt at a 45-degree angle. I'm going to lift up my presser foot and pull it out. I like to just cut the thread, flip the binding up so the edges of the binding and the quilt are in alignment, and this is at a 45-degree angle. And then I'm going to flip it down onto itself, lining up the top edge of the quilt and the fold of the binding. So these edges are even, the top of the fold are lined up, and the sides are lined up. This gets easier. It looks complicated, but it's really not. And we'll just start sewing our seam again. And I am going to back stitch. That was our last corner, and here is the tail we left. I'm going to sew down and leave about 6 inches unsewn. So I'll sew down to about here. And then back stitch. Then let's go over to the table and I'll show you how to join the 2 ends together. So there is the bottom of the quilt. We've left that much unsewn. And remember, I had that extra strip that I added on, and it's better to have too much than not enough. So that's why they're so long. But this one, I'm going to pull it up about halfway, and then I'm going to just take my scissors and cut it off. Lay the binding over the top and lift it up or set it offside just a little bit so you can see where the end of that binding is underneath. And we're going to measure 2.5 inches from that line. So there's 1, 2.5. And that's where we can cut it. And if you had wider binding, you would cut that the same length of the binding. We'll bring the right sides together and make sure they're not twisted. So we're just going to open that up and lay it flat. And bring the other end. Open it up. And lay it right sides together. Line up the edges. And then you'll draw that diagonal line from corner to corner. And what's kind of nifty on this square ruler is that has that 45-degree angle there. I'll line that up with the edge of the binding. And that's going to give me, yep, that line that I need. I'll take it to the sewing machine and sew that down. Now before you do anything else, we're going to open that up and make sure that it fits and the angle is correct. I'm going to flip it over. Looks good, fits well. If it didn't, you could unpick that and either take it in more or make the seam allowance a little smaller if you needed to. I'm going to trim off the seam allowance to 1/4 inch. Finger press that open. Bring the edges together. Clip it in place. And find out where we ended off. Backstitch and sew all the way down. This is an optional step, but I like to do it. It just gives the binding a nice crisp edge on this side. So we're going to flip the binding so the seam allowance stays flat and take the iron and press it. Okay, I'm going to get out my clips and clip around the binding. So what we want to do, since we are going to be top stitching about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fold there, and we want it to, the top stitching to come just outside in that ditch if we can, but just outside onto the binding. So you might want to, if this was a different color, I'm using white and it will be fine, you won't see that. But if it was another color, you might want to change out your needle thread and your bobbin thread so that it is the same color as the backing. So I'm going to fold that over, and I'm going to go just a little past the stitching line and clip that in place. I'm going to do that all the way around. And let me show you how we do the mitered corners. I'm going to flip that opposing side up where it needs to be and clip it in place. And then we're going to fold that all the way down and then fold it up. And you also want to consider that stitching line there. Now here's another little tip. You're going to be taking a bunch of clips off, and instead of just throwing them on the side of your machine that I do sometimes, I like to just get my little pin dish that's magnetic and set it to my side of the machine and throw them in there. Okay, I have her all clipped in place. You can use your regular presser foot and use the line on your presser foot to get a 1/8 inch seam right there, or you can use this foot, your blind hem foot. You see that little metal edge there, and use that as a guide. So it's up to you. You can also put your presser foot against the edge of the binding and then adjust your needle to the left or right to get that seam where you want it to be. I'm going to show you with this blind hem foot. I have that little metal ledge there against the inside of the binding. I'll bring my presser foot down and use my hand wheel on my sewing machine to see where that needle is going to come down. And I'm going to adjust my stitch length from 2.5 to 3.0. Top stitching, I always like to hold my top thread for the first few stitches, then I don't have that bunching up underneath or that nesting on top. And I am going to back stitch. I'm going to hold my thread, make my few stitches. Now when I get up to the corner, the mitered corner, you'll sew, just go slow, and I like to use my little stiletto, or you can use a bamboo stick or whatever to help keep that fold down. There we go. You want to keep the binding against that little metal plate. Even though I've clipped it in place, I still like to remove my clip and then realign if I need to. And if you do stop and start, I like to stop with my needle down. That means it's not going to shift around on me. Just stop right there. And make sure that things are looking like I want it to. One thing about doing it by hand, you do have a little bit more control of where your stitching lines on the other side are going to be. And just continue all the way around doing the same thing. So I finished sewing the binding on, and I am quite excited about how it turned out. This cozy warm flannel, that cute blue stripe, the mitered corners. If you want to add a cute little tag to the back side of the quilt, which I usually do if it's for a family member or a friend, and I'm giving it away, I'm going to put this Made with Love tag here in the corner. And if you want to learn how to make your own labels and tags, I have a tutorial showing you how to do that. It's really quite easy, and it's so fun to put little labels and tags on the things that you make. Just gives it that nice little extra touch and extra love to the item that you're giving away. If you're liking my content, make sure you give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and click on that bell so you can be notified when I put new videos up. You can find my patterns and other fun DIY projects and tutorials on my website, youmakeitsimple.com. If you have comments or questions, make sure you leave them in the comments section below. If you have any questions about any of the sewing supplies or things that I use, I usually have some links to those in the description below as well. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this quilting series has inspired you to start quilting if you haven't already, and using the old school method of quilting, using those quilting frames and quilting stands. Have a beautiful day, have fun sewing, and we'll see you in the next tutorial.